Yeah, probably mine, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Okay, great. So welcome everybody. I'm so glad you're here. I'm really looking forward to studying together. I think this is 75 minutes and we have a 90-year life to talk about of this magnificent human being that I was lucky to call a teacher. And so we're going to start, first of all, by dedicating. We're going to dedicate tonight's study to the memory of Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, Harav, HaKohen, Meshulam Zalman. And this is a man who loved fiercely, who lived life fully, and who faced many hardships in his life. We'll talk about a couple of them today, and never gave up heart and hope. And so, in the name of heart and hope, we are going to look and study more about his life. And I dedicate this to a week of peace. Please, God, I've never meant it as much as I mean it right now. Please, a week of peace. May the best of humanity find its face. Rabbono Shalom, please inspire all of your beloved children to find their best face, to sow it forward. And can I get an amen on that?
Amen.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to start with a song and some pictures. So we will do our first screen share, but let me get this song started first, and then I'll screen share you some beautiful pictures.
Yeah. You don't hear very well, though. No. Mhm. I couldn't hear the sound. Could you please raise your hand if you had a personal relationship with Reb Zalman?
a personal relationship. Raise your hand if you heard him speak. Raise your hand if you never had the opportunity to hear him speak. All right, this is a very unusual circle in this time. We are very, very lucky that we all knew him so well. But the point of tonight's story is not to just give a biography, but to help with an understanding of how he became the man he became. And so we are going to start by talking that the kind of the title of this whole thing is From Restoration to Renewal. But we're going to start with 1924 when he was born in August. He was born in Poland in a small town that had that was for a long time half Jewish. They had a mikvah, they had a cemetery, they had a shul, they had a butcher shop, you know, all the things that were core and basic to Jewish life. But when he was 6 months old, so this would have been in 1925, his dad felt that the small townness was such that he wanted to give his family more options. And so he moved the family to Vienna. And that's where Reb Zalman was until about 6 weeks after Kristallnacht. So his most formative years were spent there. They lived on a Matzah Island. There was a little island in the Danube, and they were right in a deep Yiddish culture. There was theaters, there was cafes, there was kosher food, and they were able to find a very safe place within the context of the fact that Austria was anti-Semitic. They found that I mean, for example, there's no time for examples, but it was an anti-Semitic town, yet there was also some places where there was give and take amongst the amongst people. So he grew up in school. He calls his youth unremarkable. He said he spent a lot of time in school just staring out the window and daydreaming. And since this is a spiritual biography, I will name the first spiritual principle that he discovered and believes in with all his heart, and that is daydreaming is essential. It is very important, especially for kids, to just stare at the clouds, to look out the window, to just daydream, because within the context of that daydreaming, you are actually building neural networking, and you're building the network for imagination. And, you know, in the imagination is the mark really of the human being. And so that is one of his fondest memories. He had so many memories of his father. His father was a Belzer Chassid from the Belzer tradition, Hasidic tradition, yet his dad went to many different shuls and different denominations. And so from a very early age, he was exposed to a lot of different ways to Jew. And his father also was known, he was one of those people that if somebody was in need, it was the dad that he would go to. I think he was much closer to his dad than his mom. He told me so many stories about his father and one or two about his mother. He also had a story of this yearning he had to understand what was going on in the church, because he would saw people going into the church. Maybe they were lighting candles, they were wearing babushkas, and he's like, that's just like my mother. She wears a babushka and lights candles. We must have something in common. But didn't do much more than that. He went to gymnasium for many years during the day and then yeshiva after school. So he was getting a secular and a religious education per his father's instructions. As things started to turn in Austria and the Nazis started to gain control, things changed a little bit for him. He tells the story one time of a young man who he had befriended in school. When they were young in fifth grade, this young man was the son of a prostitute. Um, his mother would not always pack his lunches. Reb Zalman would share his lunches. He felt connected to him. But now, several years later, from fifth grade, to like 10th grade, about 4 or 5 years later, this very same young man saw him one time with two other friends and beat him up. Um, and that was a very difficult realization for him, how the world had changed. He also tells the story of after, in the fall of 1938, he had had appendicitis, an emergency appendectomy. And he tells the story of coming across an SS soldier and being forced to do knee bends, right, with fear of tearing out the stitches, yet such it was. After Kristallnacht, everything changed, and there was no more hiding the anti-Semitism. The war on Jews really began, and his father was very soon arrested because he was so active and was the activist type. And his dad was put on a train with a bunch of other men into Poland. And right before they crossed the border, somehow his dad managed to jump out of the train and find his way back home. Everybody else on the train was exterminated as soon as they landed in Poland. So it was a miracle that his dad got away, came back home, and had to hide because they were going to be looking for him, and they realized they had to leave as quickly as possible. The journey, so this would have been like December of 38. And it was a very harrowing journey. I've read the complete account of it, which is in the Holocaust Library in Washington, D.C. And it was filled with treachery, walks at night, long miles of walking up and down hills, still recovering from his appendectomy. And they were betrayed. They were promised passage. This person didn't show up. That person stole their money, and somehow they made it to Antwerp. And they settled in Antwerp for a while, hoping to get to America. Yet getting papers signed at that time was not easy. And so they were there for some time, and Reb Zalman ended up in a studying first. He got a job in a diamond cutting factory. And it just so happened that this particular diamond cutting business was run by a Chabad rabbi. Now, pre-Holocaust Judaism, there were many different Chabad lineages. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi had many offshoots. The only one that survived post-Holocaust was the Chabad lineage. But at this point, it was a different lineage, and they would cut diamonds, and they would sing nigunim all day. Just nigun after nigun after nigun. And he ended up going to yeshiva there. They were studying Tanya, which is the master work of Shneur Zalman of Liadi. And his heart was lit on fire by these teachings. But they got papers. They found their way onto a train to get to Marseille for passage. But on the way to Marseille, the train was stopped, and they were taken to an internment camp. And they spent some time in that internment camp. And I remember this one story he told me of how hard they had to work, and labor and labor and labor. And he had to work with a whole group where they had to build this whole road of bricks. And if you've ever done hard labor, you know that feeling when you finish it, you could just go, look what I did. And as soon as he got that feeling, the next command was, now take all those bricks down. And that was the kind of psychological torture, if you will, of really trying to demean and marginalize and let them know that they were worthless human beings and nothing they did mattered. But somehow they finally found their way to Marseille, and they were there for some period of time. And Reb Zalman because he had gotten that bite for learning and he wanted more and more. And he talked a rabbi into starting a yeshiva in the Marseille camp where the Jews were being held. And he started to study and study. And he tells a story of 1939, Tu B'Shvat, when this man comes, this man that fascinated him. He wanted to know more about who he was. And he gave him this extraordinary teaching about 6,000 years, the 6,000 year evolutionary cycle leading to Mashiach. And that was his first taste of what later became his understanding of the apocalyptic ages, how every 2,000 years, there's a major shift. There is a parallel to that in Chabad thinking. They finally got to on a ship. They ended up, I think, first in Puerto Rico, and finally got to New York City. And I think it was Passover when he got there. And one of the first things he did was go to East Parkway, Chabad headquarters, because he wanted to meet Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak. By the way, that rabbi he met on Tu B'Shvat in Marseille was Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the son-in-law of Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak. And that was the first time he had seen him. And so Reb Zalman he wants to meet Shner Zalman, not Shner Zalman, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak. And he's like, I think I'll stretch the truth a little. Remember, he's still a very young man here. And he's like 17, I think, at this time. And he's like, oh, I've come to give you greetings from your son-in-law as a way. And he said within 5 minutes, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak knew everything about him. And Reb Zalman became his disciple. He became his Talmid. He became, Reb Zalman considered him his true teacher. He didn't have that relationship with Menachem Mendel in the same way, but he gave over his whole heart and soul to Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, who helped set him up and his family up, helped him find work, and Reb Zalman became a furrier. He learned the intricacies. He went from diamond cutting to becoming a furrier, learning the intricacies of how to sew pelts together and make beautiful coats. And after he had done that for some time, they ended up teaching his family how to do it so they could have work. And then he returned to yeshiva. In all of those years of study that we're talking about, one thing remained the same, and that was an intense curiosity, an insatiable curiosity, and like this way of entering the material through his emotions. When he felt anger, he expressed anger. When he felt joy, he expressed joy. When he felt grief, he expressed that grief. He was truly connected to his emotions. So now we have the second element in our spiritual biography: imagination, connected to feelings, intense curiosity. He was in yeshiva for many years. I think he ordained, I think it was 1947 when he ordained. But a year before that, he went and he taught in, first he taught in, it was in New Haven, Connecticut, for a period of time. And after that, he ended up in Rochester, New York, where he was doing more work. He became the principal of a school. He was the principal, the janitor, the teacher, the fundraiser. And then in his spare time, he had to get another job. His father-in-law helped him. He's married by this time. And he learns to become a shochet. And he worked in a butcher shop while he was there. And you could imagine, he was barely making ends meet. His wife had to get a job in a factory and knew this was no life. So he looked for a real pulpit. And his first real pulpit was in Fall River, Massachusetts, which was, I think, in 51. But there was a remarkable story that happened in 1949. We all know, am I talking too fast? Is this good? Is this pace okay?
It's fine.
Okay. Thank you kindly. And if anybody has a question or wants to break in with something at any time, you can. Otherwise, I'm just going to talk and talk. Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak was a man of extraordinary vision. And it was very important for him to establish a deep Orthodox Hasidic Judaism in America. And he envisioned outreach programs. Now, we all know about Chabad outreach, right? How many people here know that Reb Zalman, with one other person, I'll tell you who in a second, was the very first human being on the planet to do a Chabad outreach? Who knew that? All right, a couple of you. So Reb Yitzhak gathered him and Rabbi Shlomo Karlbach. And how many siblings did he have? He had one brother and one sister. One brother and one sister. And all of them made it to America soundly, along with his grandmother, who also came. And by the way, I'm not always going to see the chats, so feel free to just break in and interrupt me. So Yosef Yitzhak saw that the future was to do outreach in college campuses. And so one December, he sent Reb Zalman and Reb Shlomo to Brandeis University on Hanukkah to do outreach. And the two of them, not knowing what they were doing, Reb Zalman brought a way to play music. Of course, Reb Shlomo did as well. They brought 13 pair of tefillin. And they had a little party, taught them how to wrap tefillin. And that became the beginning of that outreach program. It's something that he really noticed is how little people knew. And this really helped anchor for him the fact that there had to be a restoration of pre-Holocaust Judaism. And this would include creating a value for a shochet, creating a value for a moil, creating a value for mikvahs, creating a value for the prayer services, creating a value for Shabbat. And he furtively worked to try and restore this. But interestingly, something happened in Fall River where he, hold on, I'm just looking at my notes on something. Yeah, so this is where he's a shochet here. But one of the first things he did in New Bedford, he went from Fall River, Massachusetts, and then to New Bedford, Massachusetts. And here he got involved in the Ministerial Association and began to check out chaplaincy work. He became very, very interested in what does a chaplain do. And by the way, ended up getting a master's in that work. And so he would go to sessions, he would go to homes. He worked with a psychologist who was doing direct analysis with using schizophrenic imagery with people. He taught high schoolers how to meditate because meditation is a very, very important part of his Chabad training. But there's something else that happened that opened it up that I almost forgot to say. This would have been in the late 40s, and he met a Yale University professor who was doing developmental psychology. He wanted to take out some books so that he could be a better teacher to the kids. Two books in particular caught his attention, and I think these two books changed the whole course of his life. The first one was called Difficulties in Mental Prayer by Father Eugene Boylan, a Trappist monk from Ireland. And the other one was Ballou's Little World Bible. And he was stunned. He thought the only ones that were doing mental prayer were the Chabadnikers. He didn't even the Belzer Hasidim didn't understand this mental prayer, but he understood, wait a second, hey, the Goyim aren't stupid, because there are certain things you learn in isolated communities about the other. He's like, they have it going on, and was incredibly impressed. And he was particularly impressed by the Gospel of Ramakrishna and how the Far East Indians, how they had rabbis. And this really, really opened him up. This would have been in 1948, and he had to start to see the world differently. So when he's in New Bedford and doing the ministerial association work, he's already tuned in to other kinds. He was nowhere near renewal. He thought everybody still had to come to the Orthodox way, and preferably the Hasidic way. So he went to Boston University in order to get his master's in pastoral counseling. That's where he met Howard Thurman, and the two met serendipitously, because like many whites who don't know better, when he first saw Howard Thurman, because he got there very early in the morning and then went to daven, and the only place to daven was in the chapel, where there's a big giant cross in the room, and he sees a man there, African American, and he's thinking, oh, it must be the janitor, in that way that white people can do. And he came the next day and he saw that the cross was covered. And he thought, what an amazing janitor who did that for me. So he left, he opened up the Tanakh, they probably called it the Old Testament, that was there, and left it on a psalm. And the next day he went, there was a psalm, a different one for him. And they conversed back and forth like this until Reb Zalman actually went to a class that Howard Thurman was teaching. And lo and behold, there he was in the front of the class. And that started a really good relationship between them. It was about this time that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. It was about this time that he read Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception, and also read a book called Fahrenheit 451, and counts all of them as very important in his development. The Doors of Perception made him very curious about states of consciousness, and he became fervent in reading about that, especially as the lysergic acid diethylmide research began later on in the late 50s at Harvard. And Fahrenheit 451, it was about a place where the books were burned. And it describes a society where people were only permitted a certain kind of reading, and anything outside of that had to be burned. And that's when he realized that he had to really open up his thought processes, really had to take in the rest of the world, and not to imagine, even though other Chabadniks were like, no, you don't look at those things. For him, it became very important in his development. The other thing that the Dead Sea Scrolls did for him is gave him the idea of creating a Noah's Ark that would carry pre-Holocaust European Judaism into the present. He ended up writing a lot about developing an urban religious monastic kibbutz that he called Qumran USA, and thought that it was really important. And one of the things that he thought was so important to restore was all the different nusachim. Nusach is the, when you hear Torah study, it's da 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 da. That would be a certain kind of nusach, or there's a different one for like Lamentations. It's all going to pop out of my head right now, but all the different tunes that go with different holidays, etc., were used to often an Ashkenazi style. But there was Yemenite, and Sephardic and Mizrahi and from all over the world, a variety of nusach. And he felt like that was, there's so many different kinds of birds and we don't want them to go extinct because each bird has its own song. For him, the nusach, all the different nusachim that he had learned and heard all of his life that was suddenly disappeared. It was very important for him to bring that back. Music was always a huge, huge part of his life. He talks about a song. This is where he also started to realize that people don't know Hebrew. And so he started to do a lot of English praying. And there was a song that he had. I don't have the tune for it, so just bear with me. But the words were, lucky, lucky, lucky me. Aren't I a lucky son of a gun? I work 8 hours, I sleep 8 hours, that leave 8 hours for fun. These are the kinds of songs that he wanted to bring into his monastic kibbutz, to have that sense of, for 8 hours, we really work our butts off to make money. 8 hours, we're just going to study. I mean, have some fun. And that's, he tried to bring music in, English in, to, and a lot of us from Bonnet have experienced some of the ways that he would put to English traditional liturgy. At this point of his life, he was not thinking of ecumenicism. He was not going interfaith. He was really holding tight. He was making relationships, learning, but he was still holding things very, very tight. He wanted to do all things about kashrut in a way that would use the current technology. And he was always on top of whatever the current technology was. In the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, through his whole life. And those of you who went to his house know that that the reading material that you would find in his bathroom were the things that that's where you'd find all the magazines on psychology. That's where you'd find all the magazines on technology. That's where you'd find, magazines about things in the world that weren't sacred, and always stayed on top of all of those things. The New Bedford situation didn't really work out in the end. He was too experimental. So he ended up in 1956 taking a Hillel job, because there's a lot of freedom in that. And he moved to the University of, he moved to Canada, University of Winnipeg in Manitoba, and he became a Hillel rabbi there. And that's really where he started to blossom. That's really where he started to learn. That's where he and his wife, he ended up having 5 children with his wife. And he did not ever talk to me about her or his second wife. And the reason that he didn't talk about either of his first 2 wives is because he said, they didn't sign up for who I became. They deserve their privacy. And so I want to stop for a second, because I think I've just been talking for 30 minutes nonstop. Is there any questions at this point? Curiosities?
So at this point in his biography, how old is he?
So now we're talking in 1956. He's in his early 30s.
Okay.
He's like, he got there when he was 32. And so he was there from 56 till about 70. So he was there for that amount of time. Yeah, he was 32 at that time when he first got there.
And he was still Orthodox, even though he was in the Hillel organization.
Completely fastidiously, passionately. Kyle, you had a question?
Yeah, you mentioned that he had this passion to bring pre-Holocaustic European Judaism. And I'm kind of curious what differentiates that from post-Holocaustic Judaism.
You know, Kyle, the devastation of the Holocaust and all those that died. There were so many different lineages in so many different ways that were just lost. You know, an example of what was lost that wasn't lost was the Piasetzner Rebbe. There was this one rabbi from the Warsaw Ghetto who is one of, you know, my top 5 favorite rabbis of the 20th century. One of the most extraordinary rabbis I've ever studied. I'm taking yet my another class with him right now, about him right now. And he was a phenomenal man, well known, was given the option to leave the Warsaw Ghetto, but refused to. And because he wanted to be with his people. And when he realized all was going to be lost, he took all of his writings and he hid them in a drum, in a big drum, and he buried them with a note saying, if this is ever found, send to Israel. The only reason we have his teachings is because he did that. How many hundreds, if not thousands, of voices were lost there? How many traditions, how many songs, how many perspectives? The devastation of the Holocaust and annihilation of so many people, that is irreplaceable. And so that is there with all like the various songs and tunes, etc. That passion for Judaism, the shtetl life, etc. That was the passion of what he wanted to restore. Does that help? Thank you. Any other questions before we? So around the early 60s,
Wayne Fairclough
besides,
has his hand raised.
oh, I'm sorry, please go.
While in New York, what was his, did he have a strong, it was Rabbi Yitzchak that was essentially his mentor at that point. Did he have a strong relationship with Schneerson as well?
Well, his relationship with Menachem Mendel was of deep respect. Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak died in 1949. Hey, you guys, I don't know if everybody knows this, but Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak and Rabbi Menachem Mendel died, I think, about 8 days apart, different years, of course. Reb Zalman's passing was right in between those two. I am convinced he chose that purposely. We had a conversation where he talked about his place in Chabad in relationship to the other two. He felt that he was an extension of Yosef Yitzchak's work. That was his Rebbe forever. But when Menachem Mendel took over, he developed a very respectful relationship. He would go for meetings. He would ask permission. He wouldn't do anything until 1968. He didn't do anything without the permission of Rabbi Menachem Mendel. So they had a close relationship, but he didn't have that devotion to him like he had to his father-in-law. Does that answer
Sure.
the question?
Thank you.
Anything else?
Yeah, what about his connection to Shlomo Carlebach?
Shlomo Carlebach, here's a fun story. He met Shlomo Carlebach in 1936. His family summered someplace and he met him serendipitously. They didn't become close, but the two of them, their lives touched there. And then it retouched in the 40s. And by that outreach, they started to develop a relationship. So I'd say from 1949 till about the early 80s, the two of them were extremely close. They were very close, but they diverged for reasons I don't really want to talk about. But let us just say that there were certain behaviors in the 70s that many people engaged in, and some people grew out of them and some people didn't. And let's leave it at that. Use your imagination to fill in the blanks. So in the early 60s, he ended up starting to go to teach at Ramah. Go to be the rabbi at Camp Ramah, which was a conservative movement camp. And Reb Zalman brought experiential education. He had the kids doing all sorts of things, making their own talit, doing experimental and experiential ways, because by now, after his several years as a Hillel rabbi, he's starting to understand, to really draw people in, it has to be engaging, it has to be kinesthetic, it has to, you have to get your hands in it in order to make it your own. And he became very involved in that movement, continued very much to be curious and develop interest in consciousness, and became very curious about that lysergic acid diethylamide that we talked about. So he started to very carefully research that and decided that he wanted to take a journey. So he went to Rabbi Menachem Mendel. I think this is 1963. He went to Rabbi Menachem Mendel and he asked for permission, because as I said, that was very important to him. And he did get that permission. So as he was deciding where to go for that, he, I just shut down something I didn't want to. Okay, I'll come back to it. Sorry, I just want to get something, a recently closed tab before I lose it. There it is. Okay. So he looked for a facilitator and he ended up contacting Timothy Leary. Reb Zalman's very first LSD trip was with Timothy Leary as his guide. I mean, who else? Of course, Howard Thurman's going to be his first, non-Jewish mentor. Of course, he's going to trip with Timothy Leary. He had a penchant for finding these masterful human beings. About this time, he also started a correspondence relationship with Thomas Merton, and they had a very close connection. He always had that way of finding the masters and creating that connection, and almost like getting that transmission on him. The LSD, indeed, he did it more than once. He wrote about it. And when he wrote about it through the Fetzer Institute, the other Chabad rabbis went nuts, absolutely nuts. Not knowing that it had been approved. And there started to be a lot of pressure as he's starting to come forth. When we get to the Davonology one, which is going to be the third one, not the second, I'm going to show you the very first little booklet he wrote in 1956. That's going to just blow you. I mean, it blows me away. The kinds of depth and how he was writing and what he was inviting people into, because he so really cared about drawing you in, about creating a theotropic. He called everything theotropic. He says, just like flowers are heliotropic and will always go to the sun, humans are theotropic, and our soul is always yearning to find God. And he felt like he was an interpreter of that. And so as his consciousness is growing, he realizes he starts to explore his relationship with Yosef Yitzhak, his relationship with the guru, and he ends up going back to get his PhD in the psychology of religion. And what he studied is his relationship with Yosef Yitzhak, and was curious, because in the Chabad world, you attach to your Rebbe. And that relationship, just like a guru, a student will attach to a guru, the same thing in the Chabad world. And he wanted to untie that. He wanted to take that projective identification and study what it meant to become his own spiritual master. And the book Spiritual Intimacy not well written, but a very good book. Out of all his books, not all of them were well written, but The Spiritual Intimacy is the story of him becoming his own master. And this really, I think he got his, I think it was 68 or 69 that he completed. Hold on, I'm looking here. I have a timeline. And by the way, there's a timeline of his life, and I'm going to put that in the chat for you. That's everyone in the waiting room. Wait, can you guys see that? That in the chat, can you see a link? No? It says everyone. Oh, there we go. There we go. Thank you. Michelle probably helped me there. Thank you, Michelle. So yeah, so that link actually has a timeline here. And so, yeah, he got 68, 69. He got his doctorate of Hebrew letters, and a part of him was finally free. He's finally free now. And let's see, 24, 34, 44, 54, 64. So now he's like 45 years old.
Charna, can I
And
ask
he's
you a question?
Yeah, of course, please do.
Sorry to interrupt.
I'm glad you did.
My question is, when he decided to become his own spiritual master, what was his reflection about a lot of other people in the Jewish community making him their spiritual masters?
You know, it's an excellent, excellent question. And he was not all about it. It was not what he wanted to cultivate at all. And, you know, the truth is, Aleph, if it had been up to Reb Zalman, the Jewish renewal movement never would have happened. The Aleph ordination program, which I'm happy to be an almost graduate of, would never have occurred, because that's not where he was going. I want to get to what his vision was, but he did not cultivate that with people. He did not want that with people. And it's one of the reasons that because I am not a guru kind of gal. And it's one of the reasons I could connect with him and attach to him, because he didn't want that. And he even said to me, you know, when you write about me, please God, let that be soon, do not put me out as a hero. Absolutely not. I'm a man. I have my faults. I'm working on myself. I don't want to be idealized. And that was so important to him. And we'll, you know, let's see where, yeah, so we're about that time in our stories. So for example, in 1972, he did a talk at the University of Manitoba on the 17 functions of charisma. Now, I've done a very deep study on charisma. My master's thesis at Naropa was on this, based on things I learned from Reb Zalman. And he understood how charisma he saw charisma as a function, let's give an example. Charisma as a function of life space. This one had a huge influence on me, actually, when I had a private practice. He said that charisma functions in such a way that if your charisma has brought in a student towards you or somebody towards you, he took this principle because he was so sophisticated psychologically. Like, we forget that this guy was an academic. His academic work, his teaching at the University of Manitoba, his teaching at Temple University, his teaching at Naropa University, he was an academic and an intellectual extraordinaire. I mean, I'll tell you that story in a second. But so Carl Levin talked about life space and how people, you know, like teachers or such a thing, they have a huge life space in one's psyche. You know, and so he said, a function of charisma, you have to understand that somebody who is looking up to you, they in their mind, they think about you. they play things around you. They hold that, you hold that function in their mind. You should always be respectful of that. You should always keep that in mind. Never take it for granted. And you know, he had 16 others were just as profound as that. And so by now, the one of the Karen, does that kind of answer your question, or at least enough?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So so now by, yes, Valerie.
One of the things I had read Spiritual Intimacy when we lived in Boston. And so I'm reading this, and he came up with, I read this term that he came up with, which is a mutant Rabbi.
Say more. I don't remember that term.
And yeah, and so it is somebody who can function as a Rebbe, but and knows the methodology of doing that, but doesn't have to live that whole lifestyle. And so it's something that you can enter and draw away from. And it was like when I saw the term mutant Rebbe, it's like, gee, that's such a good sense of humor. And here he is creating a different paradigm for how you can fulfill this function, but still have a life. And it was like, I gotta meet this guy sometime. And
And you really did. And you
And I
really
did.
did. Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem. That's beautiful. Oh, look at your daughter is like all proud of you. So that's so sweet. So in he so in religious worship, and B'nai Or later became Pnei Or as he became more egalitarian. So up until now, we're now about 1970, and he's still not what we would call, he's just starting to dawn and say, wait a second, we're turning the corner from restoration into renewal. He started to realize that renewing Judaism was really what was most important. He saw America as a unique land, unlike any other land, and that fresh things can happen here in a new way. And he's like, we need renewal. We need to find a way to spiritualize this so that our young people are not walking away. Because he saw at this point, you know, late 60s, early 70s, you know, people are going to paganism and Hinduism and Buddhism and etc. And he's like, we've got to figure out a way to spiritualize this. We've got to bring intention into things. We've got to make this accessible because we have to stop losing our young people. And in 1975, he gets a job at Temple University and moves to Philadelphia. And here is really, he's starting to go a lot to California. He's working with he helped found the Aquarian Minyan. And for me, it's amazing. Like today, I actually taught at the Aquarian Minyan Yeshiva that Reb Zalman really had a lot to do with founding, along with a couple of other people. And now tonight I get to tell his story. I'm really seeing this as an omen to push us into tomorrow. I'm believing, I'm hoping. And this is the era of free sex. I don't know where you were in the 70s. I was in Boulder from 75 to 80. I know what it was like here. It was a little wild. Anybody else here in the late 70s besides me? It was a little wild. Were you, Wayne? Awesome. And, you know, there was a lot of sex. He had already divorced his second wife, and now he meets his third wife. And this is a public story, so he doesn't mind talking about Alana. And they had an open marriage. And there was a lot of messing around. And Reb Zalman told me that if it was not for the sexual revolution renewal might not ever have happened. But in all of those exchanges, he began to listen to women in a whole different way. And he was giving a lecture one time, and a woman came up to him. I can't remember her name. And she said, Zalman, you are so sexist. He said, no, I'm not. I love women. No, you are. He said, I'll tell you what, you sit in the back of the room, and every time I say something that you think is sexist or misogynistic, you raise your hand. And just you and I will know what's going on. He said by the end of it, he realized he had to completely rewrite what he thought. And that's when he really began his time of looking at egalitarian ways, what women had to say, different perspectives, and that really cracked him open. Yes, he had an open marriage, but in the end, he didn't handle it well. And when I talked to his ex-wife in 2016, she shared with me the pain of that. The good news is, though, and I wish I had known that story when he was alive, because I would have talked to him about it. But the good news is, one of the things Reb Zalman learned from all of his years of doing psychology is the absolute necessity of doing your shadow work. The absolute necessity of never resting on your laurels that, okay, I got this now. And so I spent a fair amount of time with him. I mean, I knew him personally from 2004 to 2013 is the time I spent with him. And in that time, I had 54 one-on-one interviews, which are mostly transcripted based on the talks that we had. And that whole time I was with him, I still saw him doing his work. And especially towards the end of his life, he was almost desperate to clean up what needed to be cleaned up. Did it all get perfectly cleaned up? No. You can't live that large and not leave some problems, but it was his value to do that, and something I really respect. So at a certain point, B'nai Or became Pnei Or. In 1974, he gave his very first smicha to Rabbi Daniel Siegel, who I am very happy to say is a teacher of mine today. He did a little teaching at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in the mid 70s. He started publishing. He was that professor, and and so now in the early 80s is when he's really starting to go out into the world and share perspectives ecumenically. And when we talk next week, we're going to talk about Jewish renewal principles, and we'll really get into the deep ecumenicism. But Pnei Or Wisdom School, he founds that he meets Eve. They fall in love, and they founded a school together. And he opened up, even before, he opened up Fellowship Farm in Philadelphia, where he just started to teach. And this whole kind of renewal kind of Judaism, he started to collect people. Just many, many, many people were very interested. They were sparked. It was like, wow, you can be Jewish and Jew like this. It was so lively. And then out of the Fellowship Farm, developed the Wisdom School, and he did that with Eve. And he is really starting to travel. He did, I think it was in 1982, with Reb Shlomo and one other rabbi, they were in Bombay, and they did this big giant service for a lot of people, Jews who were in India getting their spirituality on. I think I actually have a CD of that if anybody ever wants to hear it. It was an amazing service. Hey, one of the organizers of that, Devorah and Ken, was our very own Abby Rosen, a friend of Ken and Devorah's and mine. Abby Rosen was actually one of the organizers of that Bombay concert, which is just like, because that's where she was one of those Jews that was following a Hindu guru at the time. In the community in Philadelphia, in Germantown, was very strong and very tight and very devoted to his teachings. And at a certain point, they were like, this is so good, we want to formalize this. And he's like, that's not really my intention here. My intention for you all, for what we're doing, is this renewal, this what we're doing. He almost saw it as like a fertilizer stick that would go into every denomination. He wanted to infuse, he wasn't trying to create his own denomination. He did not create the rabbinic school, the rabbinic program. That was actually created by Bert Jacobson and Marcia Prager. They're the ones who developed that. But because, and this goes back to what Karen was asking before, because he didn't see himself as the guru, he was like, you go do what you will do. I will bless it. But he was very good about giving people permission to develop things on their own. And he was in Philadelphia all the way until 1996. By here, he's starting to lecture around the world. He spent some time in Israel with Alana, and they ended up having 3 kids. And he came to Boulder in 1996. And when he came here, he was invited to be the World Wisdom Chair at Naropa University. And in Naropa's entire history, the only time a non-Jew has held that position. And he held it for 8 years. He taught there. I took his very last class. That's where I developed my personal connection with him. And then he ended up, writing, traveling, and endlessly giving talks. If you ever go into the archive at CU, you will be astonished at the amount of essays, papers, videos, audios. It is a massive amount of work. And literally what's happening now is people all over the world are going into those archives and starting to do dissertations, starting to do research on who he was and to write about it and talk about it. So there's going to be a whole nother wave that comes out. I think I'd love to take some more questions.
Hey, Charna, this is Peter. You said he came to Boulder because of the Naropa appointment. Was that the reason, or was there other reasons why he left?
I'm trying to decide how much of the whatever that word is, blossom. So it was. I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful for that.
Charna, his relationship with the interfaith community. You mentioned, several people, Thomas Merton being one of them. Did he have a lot of correspondences? I mean, do you know who he frequented or who he really corresponded with, or who his mentors were outside of Judaism?
Besides Merton and Ram Dass, who's a Jew, they had a very strong connection as well. I mean, that's a really good question. I will, I'm gonna do a little research on that. But the Dalai Lama, he ended up creating that connection with, there was in 2004, he was invited on a panel where there was like Desmond Tutu and Dalai Lama and many people of that ilk. And he was he was the Jew in the crowd. And so he pretty much at this point had access to whoever he wanted, but his deep mentors outside of like Thurman and Merton and Ram Dass, at this point, I'm drawing a blank.
Thank you.
I will tell you a lot of those correspondences though have been put into the archive.
Great.
I've got a little clip that I thought I'd show you, and I think we have just enough time for it. And this time when I show it, I'm going to optimize my screen share, so we should get a better sound on it.
I have one quick question, Charna,
Please.
and it's kind of a silly question.
I doubt it.
So it sounds like Reb Zalman lived in a lot of places. And it sparked when it's like, why did he come to Boulder? And I'm curious, did he ever tell you his favorite place he lived?
I never asked.
Just curious.
I never asked. I mean, he loved Israel. I know he loved Israel. And a part of him thought he was going to make Aliyah. He had a particular love for there. He also spent some time in Germany, by the way, in the 80s, living there. I mean, I know he loved his life here. I mean, who doesn't? I mean, you have to miss it, Kyle. I would imagine you miss Boulder.
Every day. Talk about attachment. I'm working on that.
I was gone here from 1986 to 2006, and I missed it every single day. I really get that. All right. So let's see if we can I'm having trouble with the screen share right now. So I might not end up showing this to you after all. Any other questions at this point while I'm trying to figure out my screen share world? For some reason, it's not letting me share. Oh, there we go. All right. So I think we're here. Optimize, share. Almost there, everybody. There we go. Yeah, you can see it?
Yes.
The first thing that comes to my mind is it covenantal? That is so specific that I can't find in any other religion. Despite the fact that they speak of the New Testament like the New Covenant, it's not a covenant in the same way. But if you look in the way in which the Bible talks about it, you have bespoken me, I have bespoken you, we have made this deal, I'll be your God, you'll be my people, this is what you do, this is what I do. And that whole notion of how we live in a covenantal relationship with God is important. If someone is going to say to me, I want surrender and not covenant, I say, no, Gesundheit, you can do that too, but the basis is still covenant. And that has to do with circumcision. It says basic as circumcision. It says basic as Shabbos every week. Berit olam. You know, and that word berit, I don't find in any other formulation of religion. So if someone says, I'm a conservative, a reform, a reconstructionist, are you in a covenant with God? The people who are not, what do they call the humanistic Judaism people, they might say, I'm not in a covenant with God because I don't know about God, but I'm in a covenant with the Jewish people. And even that I would buy. You understand? But because the notion of covenant, coming together and having a relationship that way. So marriage, covenant, all these things that are covenant. And the language of so many people is the spiritual people. Ego. You got to get rid of your ego. When I hear someone saying, get rid of your ego, I watch my pocketbook. My ego is a very good manager. It's a lousy boss, but it's an excellent manager. And when I say that, when somebody says, give up your ego, most of the time I look at the kids who grow up today, they don't even have an ego to begin with, you know. So I think ego is a great manager, it's a great asset that we have. It's not a good boss. What's the difference between being a boss and not being a boss? If the ego is transparent to the boss, to the soul, to God, yeah, then it's a wonderful job, does a wonderful job. That's why in Hasidism often says that you have to have bitul hayesh to destroy the something. And I say, no, we don't have to destroy anything. We only have to make it transparent. Not to offer resistance, to let the light flow through, let the awareness flow through. But the job needs doing, and it's very important. When I ask somebody, how do you want to be, what kind of a Jew do you want to be, and how do you want to be a Jew, I would want to say, you have to have a Yiddish ego, which will get upset, for instance, if you see something is not meeting equity, is not meeting justice, If you see there is something enslaving people, If you see how society is made wrong, look at the number of Jews who have had the feeling somehow that they want to be in politics and fix the world. I'm smiling because I remember a story I want to tell. In Winnipeg, there was a man by the name of Rabbi Moshe Gray. Gurari was his name, but he advertised as Gray. He was a member of parliament, and he also had a travel agency. So people who wanted to send money to the Ukraine, to this and that, he handled a lot of things. And he was the representative of a district where most immigrant Jews, Ukrainians and Russians and Poles lived. So they all came to Moshe Gray, who was their ombudsman, and if he needed to fix something, he fixed it. He was elected year after year after year. This constituency didn't let go of him. He was a sweetheart. Shabbos morning, he would go to the Schwitz with another buddy, Mr. Simkin, and they would finish at the Schwitz in time when we were making Kiddush in Shul, and then he would come and hang out with the buddies in Shul, because what was going on for them? To them, Shabbos was Schwitz, not davening, but Kiddush, is another story to hang out with the folks. So Moshe Gray calls me one day, and he says, Zalman, I need a favor from you. No, who wouldn't do Moshe Gray a favor? He does favors for everybody. And he says, every year I give a speech that gets printed in the Hansard that I am a socialist, but I'm not a socialist from Marx. I'm a socialist from Isaiah. And I want to know, could I maybe be a socialist from Jeremiah? So I had to find for him stuff from Jeremiah, and every year he graduated to Amos and to, finally he was a socialist from Pirkei Avot the year he passed on. So I'm just telling you, that wonderful sense that we have about equity is just in that way. So he davens in the Schwitz, so what? But when it comes to making sure that people should know he cares for people because of Isaiah. Yeah.
A taste of the Rebbe. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your attention. I hope this was instructive. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. And again, next week, we will go over what are some of the principles that he brought into the world. And if you haven't voted, vote. And I look forward to seeing you next week in a good world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amen.
Thanks much,
Thank
China.
you.
Amen. Seriously.
Thank you.
Amen.
Charna.
Thank you so much.